Good morning, everyone. This is Seth Moore again, coming to you here on Anchor by Spotify. It is a 79 degrees day here in the Love State, sunny, and clouds are intervariably going in and out. So it's going to be an 84 degrees day here. So we hope that you are starting your day out real well, and again, that you are preparing yourself for what is actually coming, and that you are staying in a posture of preparedness, and that you are doing introspection concerning your life and all those things that concern you and the things that are around you, and that you are aware of what is actually happening on a global scale and a daily basis. Sometimes some of us, we don't think that things are really important because oftentimes we're paying attention to the wrong things because we are distracted by things that are around us. We are more consumed with, as I often say, touch, taste, hear, feel, and taste, all these things. And so we don't pay attention on a global scale to actually what's going on and that is affecting us. Okay, so we're here because obviously we're going to finish up what we've been talking about, the whitening of Afro-Latin America, and how all of this ties in. And we've been talking about the islands. We did a podcast on the Black Hawaiians, and hope that you're tuning in, hope that you're paying attention, hope that you're getting this information and that you're actually processing it, and that you are looking around and you're observing exactly what is going on in the world. Now, some of you may say, oh man, that ain't important. I'm doing this and I'm doing that, and I ain't thinking about none of this other stuff. Okay. And so a lot of this happens because, number one, it's been planned. Number two, is not by happenstance. And number three, or maybe that should be number one. Number three, I'll say because it is written. And that should be actually number one. So this is a time of great deception, and people are paying attention to the wrong things. And trust me, no one is saying to you you shouldn't live your life. No one is saying that. We're just saying be conscious, be aware of what's going on. Because oftentimes, again, we pay attention to the wrong things, and we don't deem what's going on in the world as important to us, and until it hits our doorstep, then it becomes very important. And so we should be cognizant of what's taking place and what's happening, and process this and say, okay, where do I fit in all this? What should I be doing? What's really important? How do I organize my life? How do I manage my life? How do I manage the things that are around me? When I do introspection, what is actually things that I should be putting in place? Should I make any changes in what I'm doing? Or should I just continue to live the way that I'm living? Which means that, I'm chasing a bag. I'm trying to get recognition for this. I'm trying to build my business. I'm trying to bring more funding or more revenue to my family. I'm trying to, you know, now, let me say this. Let me say this. Depending upon how you structure your life, how you manage your life, that is your business. That is your business. And I'm not saying that the things that I just mentioned, you shouldn't be doing. What I am saying is, what is the reason for it? Do you have, when you set out to do something, because oftentimes people do, when you set out to do something, there's usually a motivation behind what you're doing. Why are you doing what you're doing? What is the reason for what you're doing? Is it because you are seeking fame? Is it because you're seeking notoriety? Because you're seeking riches? You're seeking to be seen? If you're seeking things on those premises, I would beg to differ that you're not going to affect a lot of people. You're not going to bring about a whole lot of change if you are seeking things on those premises. Because let me say to you that I'm singing to the choir, because there are things that obviously I'm doing as well. But my motivation for the reason and why I'm doing it is not because I want fame, I want notoriety. You know, I want riches. It's more about legacy. What can I do where it's going to affect change? How is this going to help make where I am and around me, the world, a better place? By what I'm doing, how is it going to affect people? What differences are they going to make? So that's for me. I don't know about you. That's for me. I'm beyond past. Back years ago, I did a lot of things where, of course, the culture you're in for a lot of different reasons. But as you get older, if you're not changing, if you're not growing, something is wrong. If you're not raising your consciousness about, the reason, the why, the when, the how, then something is absolutely wrong. Okay? And so that's what I'm saying. What we're going to do, we're going to pause for a moment and we're going to move on. We're going to begin to conclude on this study, and then we're going to move on to another, and we're still talking about the islands. We're going to move on to the Marshall Islands next. We're going to talk about how the U.S. has done these nuclear tests and how it's affecting the indigenous people of these islands. And we're still talking about the islands. But again, I want you to understand something. And the reason why I said what I said a moment ago in regards to how things affect us. And a lot of you are not even aware. There have been testings that have been done under the water, in the ocean, that affect the ecosystem, that affect the water that you drink, and so forth and so on. And a lot of you are not even aware of this. So when I talk about the importance of things, how it affects us, a lot of us, it's really kind of sad. You know why? Because they say, if you want to hide something from us, particularly black people, put it in a book. Because we don't read. A lot of us don't read. And I'm not saying all of us, but the majority of us don't. Because we're in that type of culture where this kind of illusionary reality has been created for us, and we follow it. We follow it. We follow it like clockwork. We really do. We follow it like clockwork. And so, with this being said, and this illusionary, apparatus that has been created, and how we follow it to the letter is amazing. Is absolutely amazing. We just follow it. But we're going to pause for a moment, and we're going to come back. We're going to begin, and then we're going to move on from there. Hopefully, we'll finish up and conclude on this, so we can go on to the next podcast and the next segment episode. Okay, stay with us. Okay, and we're back again here on Anchor by Spotify. This is Seth Moore again, coming to you to bring you again another podcast, a continuation of what we've been talking about, the whitening of Afro-Latin America. And as I mentioned, we're going to be trying to finish this up today, and we're going to be moving on. So let us begin. Workers and unions. No other 20th century Latin American government proposed or carried out racial policies as murderous as those of the Trujillo regime. But the labor demands of the export boom, the programs of racialized labor migration pursued by employers and governments, and the arrival in the region of millions of Europeans, West Indians, and Asians, all these factors combined to produce situations of enormous economic, social, and political tension and stress. Did you hear that? And stress. So again, we're picking up here, and we hope that you're following the podcast in succinction. So, because we have them online, and they're all lined up where you can actually listen to them succinctly in succession. So one will follow the other. And so where I'm actually picking up at, you can go on and listen. And all the information, like a book, it'll all tie in, paragraph by paragraph, chapter by chapter, and so forth. Okay? So it goes on to say, given the racial ideologies of the age and the explicitly racial character of government and employer programs aimed at promoting labor immigration, these tensions inevitably asserted themselves along racial and ethnic lines and were felt particularly strongly by black workers, because we're still talking about Afro-Latin America, the whitening of Afro-Latin America. And as you heard me in former podcasts talk about how the Europeans came in and began to, like they always do, y'all know, because this is why we have all this consternation going on in the world now. And if you're keeping up with what's going on in the continent now, we're seeing these coups that are ousting these puppet presidents who care very little or at all about the economic situations in their country, where they're puppets for the West and the European nations, and how that for the longest time they've robbed the country. They robbed the country so so hellaciously. It's incredible. It's just ridiculous, And so this is what's been happening for the longest time, and it's just been a very horrific situation in regards to, the people in the country, and you got poor children running around. You got the GDP. Most of their GDP is being ousted and going to the European countries, while you have this one family who's ruling and who has been ruling for the past 50 years, such as one president that they ousted, President Bongo, or whatever his name is, from Gabon, and they should get that clown out. You know what I mean? His family has ruled the country for over 50 years, and his family has been a puppet for the West. This guy, they found billions of dollars in bags in his house. You know what I'm saying? Of all different currencies, and he's just been robbing the country like you would not believe. 70 bank accounts and villas in Italy and Switzerland, and he has a daughter in the U.S. where he sent her a couple of $1 million, shrink wrapped in a bag, and she's buying off people in the U.S. and just all kinds of nonsense. But I'm so glad that this is changing, and they're beginning to oust these presidents, and they're beginning to take back their countries, which they should do. They should do. Absolutely, they should. And I'm glad that this is actually taking place and it's happening, because it's unreal. It's really unreal, And so there's a movement that's actually going on in the continent now. And hopefully, prayerfully, this will reverberate and translate over here, where we start working with our African brothers and sisters. I know that we have problems with them because, of course, you have Africans that come here and they look at us a different way. And, so we need to stop all that. We need to stop that. I'm not saying it's easy to do, but we need to stop. We need to find ways in which we can get along. Because their problems are our problems. Our problems are their problems. Because I often say, and I've said it in many podcasts that I've done, all roads leads back to the continent. And why is that? Because the continent has everything that all of these world powers need and always have. And this is the only way that these European powers have built their economies. That's the reason why they're economically solvent. It's because of the continent, the gold, the diamond, the copper, the manganese, the asbestos, the cobalt, the iron ore, the lithium. I can go on and on and on and on and on. All of these European nations are economically solvent because they've exploited the continent for hundreds of years, okay? And this is why they are where they are today. And so this is why you have all this ruckus now, because the Africans are taking their countries back, and they have these European countries nervous. Even the United States. They say, no, you're not going to exploit us anymore. Enough is a damn enough. Enough is enough. And now they have these leaders, and I hope that there'll be more coups, that they'll oust these puppet presidents and put in people who actually have a backbone and care about the nation and care about the people, and not allow these devils to keep continuing with this raping of the continent. Okay, we're going to move on. Okay. And as I read, we stopped at black workers. As Europeans arrive in the region, they displace black workers in almost direct proportion to their relative numbers. The greater the number of immigrants, the more devastating the impacts on local black populations. Thus, in Buenos Aires, where by 1914 had 780,000 immigrants and fewer than 10,000 Afro-Argentinians, or Afro-Argentines. Okay, the latter were virtually eliminated from the skilled trades, factory employment, and even street vending, in which they had been quite visible through the 1870s. By 1900, workers of color were confined almost entirely to domestic service, occasional day labor, and low-level service positions in government offices. So now, what you see here is what has been happening for centuries. Make no mistake about it, y'all. This has been going on for centuries. Subjugation, exploitation, okay? Dehumanizing always is a chess game. We can't let them have political power. We have to move the pieces on the chessboard over here. We got to disadvantage them over here. We got to bring in a wider population. We have to bring in Europeans. And as you heard me read in former episodes, where even the government went as far is to spend money out of their government coffers to bring in Europeans to whiten up the place, so they can cause confusion, so they begin to drop their seed in different areas, and this all is confusion. And this is why I was saying before that you have people who don't even want to claim their blackness, like Afro-Argentines and Dominicans saying, I'm not black and I'm not this. They blacker than you and me. So this is causing confusion. And so what it does politically, it begins to usurp the political structures in a lot of these countries where there is great division. Okay. So as you just hear me read, by the 1900s, it says workers of colors, as I read, confined almost entirely to domestic service, occasional day labor, and low-level service positions in government offices, whereas before they had greater positions. But they're always a way to try to diminish or demise so that you become a slave or you're working in a role of servitude. And that's why I was saying before, in this country, a lot of the times you really don't own anything. They're letting you borrow your money back. The money that they took from you. Think about that. They're letting you borrow it back. And then they taxing you on it. Think about that. They take the land, which is yours. They create a government is created from a government in the Constitution that was already in place before they got here. And they just tweak that and say, okay, this is the way we're going to do it. We're going to take your stuff, and now we're going to make you work for us with your own stuff. And then we're going to tax you too. And anytime you buy something, we're going to tax that. And we're going to tell you on paper that if you don't pay us, we're going to come and get it. And we say, oh yeah, okay, yes, master, yes, boss. And then we think we have something. Take your stuff and make you pay for it and tax you on it. Okay, let us go on. The displacement of black workers in the Brazilian state of São Paulo, where by 1920 the immigrant population was 830,000 and Afro-Brazilians some 650,000, were almost as extreme as in Buenos Aires. In the state capital, by the early 1900s, the labor force in construction and industry was 80 to 90% foreign-born. Listen to that. Some Afro-Brazilians found regular jobs in factories or as laborers building the city's trainways and power grids, but most were relegated to domestic service and informal day labor. Now, let me say this. You do know that during the transatlantic slave trade, that the highest concentration of population of slaves were dropped in Brazil. So Brazil, in other words, Brazil has the highest concentration of African people in the world. You'll find them. They have more people in Brazil than they do here in the U.S. Okay, see, because they say that we're around 40 million. Brazil has more than that. And we're probably above 40 million because they always say that. They always say, well, we're 13% of the population. It's all these statistics are lies. We're more than that. But what I'm saying is that Brazil has a higher concentration of African people. Okay? And so it says, because it said by 1920, listen, the immigrant population was 830,000. And the Afro-Brazilians, some 650,000, were almost as extreme as in Buenos Aires in the state capital. By the early 1900s, the labor force in construction industries was 80 to 90%. As I read, foreign-born. Some Afro-Brazilians found regular jobs in factories or as laborers building the city's tramways and power grids, but most were relegated to domestic service and informal day labor. Okay, more of an equilibrium was struck in Rio de Janeiro, where Afro-Brazilians continue to outnumber Europeans, which they should, and manage to retain a place in the wage labor market as transport workers and dock workers and in factory employment. In commerce and the skilled trades, however, Europeans were strongly preferred, and within the industrial sector, there were clear disparities between the two groups. Afro-Brazilians were most likely to be found in the textile industry, the most poorly paid industrial employment. European textile workers were far more likely to be paid an hourly wage and thus to have higher earnings than Afro-Brazilians, who were generally paid piecework rates. Okay, piecework rates. Listen to this. See, now these are the Europeans that they brought in. Okay, who the land wasn't theirs, mind you, until they took over. And this is why I want to say what I was going to say earlier, is that I used to have a thing with people who were, and I've mentioned it, you guys heard me, they're coming in the country and so forth. A lot of these people from Venezuela, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Mexico, Dominican Republic, Cuba, these are our brothers and sisters, a lot of them. But the divide has been to divide us by skin color. And so this is why I was saying before, a lot of people don't want to be associated with black folks until they think they're going to get something. Okay? So I'll read on. Much the same was true in Cuba, where Afro-Cubans retained employment opportunities in construction and industry, but complained of being relegated to the least skilled, most poorly paid positions. A main area of conflict was the tobacco industry, in which Cubans formed the majority of workers, by Spaniards were favored for better paid positions as cigar rollers. So marked was the preference for Spaniards that many Cuban rollers left the island to seek work in the United States. Fueling the growth of the cigar industry in Tampa and Key West, Spaniards were also favored for employment in cigarette factories. Their wages ran some 30% higher than in the cigar factories. Why is that? Because these are people that look white. So you got a lot of Cubans that look white. So they were favored over the darker Cubans. And also the Spaniards that look white. Okay? So this is how they did it. They completely dominated employment and commerce, as well as technical positions in industry, including the all-important sugar industry. At the level of field workers, seasonal migrants came from Spain every fall to work in the sugar harvest, returning home in the spring with their earnings. Their presence formed a formidable obstacle to black cane cutters' efforts to bargain for higher wages. Not for nothing did the Afro-Cuban's newspaper column, Ideales de una Raza, complain in 1929 of blacks being caught between two great evils, foreigners in the cities and foreigners in the countryside, but why were European workers so consistently able to push Afro-Latin Americans aside in the competition for jobs? Part of the answer lies in the racialized images that employers held of European and Afro-Latin American workers, the former as industrious, reliable, and responsible, the latter as lazy, recalcitrant, and irresponsible. Both images corresponded to the racist ideologies of the period. The image of black workers was far further grounded in employers and especially landowners. Experience with black laborers' resistance to an intensive bargaining over working and living conditions, first under slavery and then during the post-emancipation years. Ex-slaves and their descendants were determined to avoid work regimes or employment that violated their understandings of freedom. For many employers, this made them deeply problematic as potential employees. Okay, so they didn't want to hire people who were going to complain about, the conditions and the fact that you came in my country and took over, and you got me working for peanuts. You see what I'm saying? But yet you bringing in Europeans and you're acculturating the society and the culture where you got these mulatto people who look like you, and you're giving them jobs over us because of all of this racialized bull malarkey. You understand? And this is the game that has been continually played over time. Go in, seize land, control the people, control the economics of a country, create havoc, bring divide amongst the people, divide and conquer. Okay, let us move on. Once arrived in the region, European workers proved no more submissive than their black counterparts to local forms of labor discipline. I also want to say this too, because the whole notion of black people being lazy, and that we weren't compliant. And what they want is they want a compliant individual who is not going to complain, who's going to go for the okie doke, and just be one of those kind of people where okay, I'm gonna just come in here and I'm gonna slave myself until I drop dead, and I'm not gonna say nothing. But they didn't have people like that. They wasn't going for that. Sorry. They just weren't, and you can't blame them. So who's lazy? I mean, these people. Let me tell you something, which a lot of you already know. White folks have been on welfare since they hit the shores of America. Okay, because as we all know, when you look at the history, they came here poor peasants, fleeing religious and other persecutions from England, France, Italy, Germany, Poland, Ireland, you name it. They came here piss poor in the early 1900s and before that. Okay, and of course when all of this stuff was going on in the 1800s through, the Atlantic slave trade and so forth. These people came here, they didn't have anything. They came here piss poor, diseased, looking for a leg up. And the government, through a lot of our presidents like Eisenhower, Woodrow Wilson, gave these people a leg up. Loans for homes, we all know the stories. Land grants for farming, all of this kind of stuff. while at the same time denying the owners of the land through subjugation and manipulation and exploitation, you know, their constitutional godly rights as a people, as a human species to thrive. So they could never talk about anybody being lazy, because everything was handed to them once they hit the shores of America, besides what they, of course, you know, what they took and stole and killed and murdered and so forth and so on. So I wanted to just say that. Okay, so it talks about once they arrived, the European workers proved no more submissive than their black counterparts to local forms of labor discipline. In other words, it's gonna be hard to get a white person because of what, I don't know what they think, but they think, and they always have, they think that they're better than indigenous people. I should be over you. I should have more than you. I should tell you what to do. You should be my slave, you know, and all this kind of stuff. As you heard me read here. They say they prove no more discipline, no more submissive rather, than their black counterparts to local forms of labor discipline. In Argentina, Brazil, Cuba, and elsewhere, they took a prominent role in labor mobilization and work stoppages. As many as half of the Europeans who came to Latin America either returned home or moved to the United States rather than submit, listen y'all, rather than to submit to employer demands. Nevertheless, okay, because in some of these places, mind you, they had Afro-Latinos, or not Latinos, but Afro-Latin workers who had African blood, who were running a lot of these places. But trust me, a lot of the Europeans felt like, I'm not working under this person, just like it is now. They don't want to work under some black person who's their boss. So you did have that too as well. And it said as many of half who came to Latin America, they say they either return home or move to the United States, rather than to submit to employer demands. Nevertheless, they remain much sought after and continue to receive preference for employment throughout the export period. Racial doctrines of the time were partially responsible, but equally important were kinship and ethnic ties among immigrant workers and between immigrant workers and employers. While most Europeans worked as laborers, a number succeeded in establishing themselves as small tradesmen and shopkeepers. In Buenos Aires in 1940, some 80% of the shopkeepers and owners of workshops and small factories were immigrants. Europeans were similarly overrepresented among employers in Cuba, Uruguay, and Sao Paulo. Immigrant proprietors showed a strong tendency toward ethnic solidarity in their hiring practices, and immigrant workers capitalized on that tendency by bringing in their relatives, friends, and neighbors to apply for jobs at the firms where they work. Does that sound familiar to y'all? Does that sound familiar? How you've heard people in the United States say when the Mexicans, they get a job, they'll bring all their people. And I mean, you can't blame them. You can't blame them. I mean, really, you can't. You can't blame them. See, because it stems from this. So you have to, the unfortunate part about that is that those people who are hiring them, you understand what I'm saying? So this goes way back. So they did it then to outnumber the Europeans. So they would bring their own people to to acquire these positions. Okay? Black peasants and Labotos were in a sense doubly dispossessed by the developments of the export years first pushed off land they had farmed as slaves. Listen, and tenants and squatters, and then as they sought wage employment on plantations or in the cities, denied such employment on racial grounds. But racial preferences in hiring could and did damage the interest of white workers as well. The presence of a chronically underemployed black labor force held wages low for all workers, including whites. And in moments of confrontation between white workers and their employers, the latter did not hesitate to exploit racial divisions within the labor force. In the Brazilian port of Santos, the city's dock and warehouse monopoly resorted to Afro-Brazilian strikebreakers, many of them former slaves, to break immigrant-led strikes during the 1890s and early 1900s. Textile firms of Rio de Janeiro threatened to replace rest of Italians and Spanish workers with unemployed Portuguese and Afro-Brazilians. And in 1990, the São Paulo Tramway Company broke a strike of white conductors and drivers by promoting black workers who previously had been confined to lane track. In each of those cases, black strikebreakers were used against white strikers, but racial divisions could just as easily be used against black strikers. During the first decade of the 1900s, most port workers in Havana were Afro-Cuban, organized not by unions but by the Abacua lodges, which controlled the docks and negotiated contracts with dock and warehouse companies. When the port workers joined the general strike of 1935, the companies brought in 900 strikebreakers, most of them native-born white peasants, from southern Havana province. Following the defeat of the strike, these replacement workers were retained in their positions, creating a majority white workforce and breaking the Abacua Lodge's control over hiring. So here it is. They had to bring in all these white workers. See, and this was at the time, of course, the whitening up of these areas where they seized control over these areas, and this global hegemony that was like taking place on all the islands, where they brought in all these people and they began to take full control of the industries, the sugar industries, the fruit industries, and so forth, where they subjugated the people who were once the landowners, and now the whole thing switched. Okay? Undoubtedly, the most effective cultivator and exploiter of ethnic and racial divisions among his workers was the United Fruit Company. Listen to this. The company defeated early strikes on its Costa Rican plantations by defiantly exploiting conflicts among groups of workers from different Caribbean islands. Following a second wave of strikes in 1918 and 19, it began to diversify the labor force further by hiring native-born Hispanics from the Central Highlands, producing a series of tense confrontations between black and white banana workers in Honduras. Hispanic labor organizers sought to mobilize workers along explicitly racial lines, identifying as their principal enemy not United Fruit, but the ruinous competition posed by the West Indians. This was a potentially explosive strategy. In 1924, more than 1,000 West Indians had to be evacuated by steamship from Puerto Rico to Trujillo, where rioting Hispanic workers threatened to kill them. A similar Confrontation in 1929 was narrowly averted when the company closed down its railroad, thus preventing angry Hispanic workers on inland plantations from traveling to the port. In Costa Rica, 500 native-born workers and Limon petitioned the Costa Rican Congress in 1925 to bar United Fruit from hiring West Indians as office workers and salesmen or in other white-collared or supervisory positions. In 1933, another group of almost 600 workers again wrote to Congress to protest. So this is what they do. Create division. So you pit one group against another. So you keep the machination going on. You keep it fueling while you can come in and take control of the resources. It's an old trick. Here we go. The black problem, which is of transcendental importance because in the province of Limon, it constitutes a situation of privilege for this race and of manifest inferiority for the white race to which we belong. It is not possible to get along with them because their evil ways do not permit it. For them, the family does not exist, nor does the honor of the woman, and thus they live in an overcrowding and a promiscuity which is dangerous for our homes, founded in accordance with the precepts of religion and the honorable customs of the Costa Ricans. We beg the sovereign constitutional Congress to remedy this humiliating situation in our own fatherland by a race inferior to our own, which has no right to invade our countryside, our cities, and our homes. The sovereignty of our nation is at stake. Communist Hispanic organizers fought hard to overcome such prejudices and to forge a cross-racial labor movement on the banana plantation but divisions between Hispanic and West Indian workers proved too strong. As a result, the principal confrontation between United Fruit and its workers, the General Strike of 1934, was carried out almost entirely by Hispanics and foundered in large part because of West Indian abstention. So they got to win them. They said, you know, these inferior people come in our land and take over, and they knew they was inferior. Come on. You know, you come and take over our stuff and then you try to tell us what to do. In Brazil, ethnic and racial tensions were visible in workplaces, in confrontations in bars and on street corners, and occasionally in full-fledged riots. Italy's invasions of Abyssinia, first in 1895 and again in 1936, provoked fighting in Sao Paulo between blacks and Italians. Competition between black and Italian carnival clubs and working-class neighborhoods of Rio de Janeiro erupted in considerable violence, leading Italians to appeal to their consul for protection. And on May 13, 1908, the 20th anniversary of emancipation, fighting broke out between black and Portuguese members of the Rio Port Workers Union after two Portuguese candidates were elected president and treasurer of the historically black union. In the weeks following the altercation, the organization collapsed, losing almost all of its 4,000 members. The League of Cuban Workers was founded in Havana in 1899 specifically to defend its members from Spanish competition, calling for national legislation that would require a minimum of 75% of native-born workers in every enterprise. The League centered its efforts on the tobacco industry, where in 1902, Cuban workers struck to demand equal access to apprenticeships without distinctions of race. Despite mediation by a blue ribbon committee of black and white independent war commanders, the strike failed and the League collapsed shortly thereafter. It left in its wake a counter-organization of Spanish anarchists, the Workers' Alliance, which accused the League of aggravating ethnic and racial tensions in the labor movement. Cuban activists with employers' racial preferences. There are guilds where work is so monopolized by Spanish workers that the few Cubans work in the trade, he bitterly observed, and not one black. See, it's amazing.
It's amazing how they do. You know, they gonna hire. You know, you got an all black union, and it'll be the same, an all black union, but they'll put a white person over the union. Why? Control the resources. That's what it's about. Control the resources and the decision making when it comes to power. That's how they do it. Okay. To the workers who experienced them, these racial and ethnic conflicts were deeply and sincerely felt, far from being the illusory product of false consciousness. They corresponded to black and white, native-born and foreign workers' lived experience and to their perceptions of each other's as different and real and important ways. These conflicts were then further aggravated by racialized immigration programs and employers, overt hiring preferences, which structured the intense labor market competition of those years along racial and ethnic lines. Under these conditions, it is hardly surprising that throughout the region, racial and ethnic division should have been a principal obstacle to workers' efforts to organize. What is surprising is that workers and organizers persisted in trying to overcome that obstacle and reaching across ethnic and racial divides to construct a unified pan-racial labor movement. The very fact that, for example, Afro-Brazilians and Portuguese workers came to blows in Rio Dock Workers Union in 1908 reflects their attempt to join forces in a single cross-racial organization. And while that particular effort failed, others were more successful. How were workers in Latin America able to come together to create the cross-racial alliances that proved so hard to construct in the United States and elsewhere? One reason was the laws and ideologies of racial egalitarianism that had been forged during the independence period. Even if honored as much as in a breach as in the observance, these historical precedents made racial exclusion or segregation legally and politically unacceptable, even during the whitening years. Though such exclusion and segregation were in fact common in elite and middle-class circles, they were always explained and justified in terms of class rather than race. Within the working class, no such explanation was possible, with the result that even during a period of white supremacist ideology throughout the Atlantic world, the strong tendency in Latin American labor movements was to reject racial preferences of any kind and to push for inclusive cross-racial mobilization. This was partially a matter of practicality. Except in Argentina and Uruguay, no Latin American labor movement could hope to be successful unless it included that majority, or in Cuba, large minority of the population that was non-white and that had long formed the bulk of the region's workforces. The massive European immigrations and of export years undercut that numerical dominance in some areas of Afro-Latin America, but especially in Brazil and Cuba. Immigrants activists soon realized that it was suicidal to confront employers who could call on large reserve armies of unemployed blacks and mulattoes. Far better to face employers in the state as one unified movement than as separate, divided racial groups. And this is what they do. If you don't comply, they have another group of people standing by to come and take your work. Why? Because it's a system of divide and conquer. And of course, the people were tired of seeing this lopsided, this lopsided economic hegemony going on. Okay, and it's the same way in the continent, where you have, for instance, like let's look at South Africa. You have a majority of black people, and there's a small population of white people that still controls the economics of the country. You understand what I'm saying? And although you still have a majority black ANC council, but they don't control the economics of the country. It's still a small white minority, contingency that controls the economics of the country. And that shouldn't be. Not especially on your own land. Okay. A final factor that promoted cross-racial mobilization was the long history of such organizations among Afro-Latin Americans themselves. Slaves and free blacks had carried out some of the earliest strikes in Latin American history, and blacks and mulattoes had been intimately involved in the artisan guilds that played a prominent role in 19th century politics. Black involvement in labor mobilization continued up unabated during the years of the export boom. Though immigrant activists predominated in Sao Paulo and the other southern states of Brazil, Afro-Brazilians played an important role in the labor movement of Rio de Janeiro, and even more so in the Northwest. Mulatto activists Luiz da Franca da Silva and Gustavo de Losada were instrumental in the creation in the 1890 of Brazil's first labor-based political party, in the Partido Operário, and the convening of the Brazil's first Socialist Labor Congress. 2 years later, a chapter of the party also opened in Salvador, where it succeeded in electing Afro-Brazilian journalist Manuel Quirino to the city council. Visiting the northeastern city of Recife, and the 1910 São Paulo activist Everardo Dias was startled to find that, despite the absence of the foreign element, the labor associations are well established. And it shows that we have a couple of minutes left, so we're going to finish this up, and we're going to, be ending, and we'll go on to the next one. Have suitable headquarters. This very Brazilian working class demonstrates more class consciousness and more enthusiasm than Sao Paulo's foreign proletariat. This, for me, was a revelation. That's what he says. Afro-Brazilians were responsible for one of the most dramatic outbreaks of the labor conflict under Brazilian First Republic, the naval mutiny of 1910 in Rio de Janeiro, in what became known as the Revolt of the Whip. Sailors on 4 warships in the Rio harbor took over their vessels and disposed their officers, while those officers were entirely white. An estimated 80% of the crewmen were Afro-Brazilians, including their leader, veteran seaman Jairo Candido. The mutiny was sparked by the particularly brutal 250 lashes whipping up a shipmate, and petitions and open letters to the Brazilian authorities in public. The sailors demanded the ending of the corporal's punishment, which had recently been abolished in the British Navy. And the enforcement of their full rights as sailors, Brazilian citizens, and Republicans. They insisted on being treated as a navy of citizens, not a plantation of slaves who received nothing from their masters save the right to, and we're going to be ending up in a few seconds, to be whipped. And we'll come back and we'll finish up. We got a little bit more here. And so Again, this is Seth Moore coming to you here on Anchor by Spotify. We will see you very soon. Okay, and we're back, and we're going to be finishing up here, and we're going to be moving on. So again, here, this is Seth Moore coming to you here again on Anchor by Spotify by the way of Spreaker, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Podbean, Patreon, and many, many other host sites. So again, we are going to be finishing up here, and we will conclude, and we will be bringing you another podcast as we move ahead. Okay, so we ask that you would continue to support us and stay with us, listen and tune in, and smash that button for us, and we will be so grateful that you've decided to join us. Okay, so let us finish up here. In Cuba, unlike the rest of Latin America, colonial caste laws remained in effect for most of the 1800s, leading Spanish artisans to try to maintain a racial exclusivity in their organizations. Most of the artisan mutual aid societies formed in Havana during the first half of the century were exclusively white and the majority Spanish. When artisans from various trades joined together in 1857 to create the first Cross Guild Society, its charter explicitly barred blacks and mulattoes from membership. As a result of the independence struggle, many of the guilds then dropped their racial barriers in the 1870s and 1880s, admitting Afro-Cubans to the membership. By the early 1900s, blacks and mulattoes were exercising leadership positions in a number of Havana, Matanza, and Santiago unions. See, they have to do that when they see you coming together, when you begin to mobilize and say, okay, you know what? We're not going for it. And when you begin to hit them in their pockets, hit them where they live at, because it's all about money, right? So you say, okay, so we're going to boycott you, or we're going to not come to work. We're going to shut your ass down. You know, just like they had in Florida. You know what I'm saying? You get somebody else to pick your fruit, okay? Let's see if you get out here in the hot sun. And then we'll see who's lazy, okay? We'll see who's lazy when your ass got to be out here with a basket picking strawberries and mangoes and avocados and all the stuff that you enjoy that don't grow where you come from. We'll see then, okay? So this is what happens. Okay, so this is what they did. They used what they had to get what they wanted. The tendency towards cross-racial organizations was even more marked in the Cuban countryside, where the independence wars and the struggle against slavery had initiated the beginnings of mobilization among sugar workers. By 1902, Spanish anarchists and Afro-Cuban independent war veterans had joined together to lead a major strike of sugar workers in Santa Clara province, which they coordinated from the headquarters of the local Centro Africano. Despite the defeat of this strike and others, Spanish and Cuban, both black and white activists continued to work together on the plantations, proving a formidable enough threat that sugar companies decided to hire West Indian workers, in part because non-Spanish speakers would be harder for unionists to recruit. The arrival of the West Indian contract laborers greatly complicated labor and organizing conditions in Cuba, producing probably the most complex mixture of race, nationality, ethnicity to be found elsewhere in Afro-Latin America. Confronted by these obstacles, the labor movement might easily have foundered, and in fact, as the sugar economy sank deeply into crisis during the 1920s and 30s, many Cuban-born workers, both white and black, called for an end to Spanish and West Indian immigration and the reserving of increasingly scarce jobs in sugar and other industries for native-born Cubans. explicitly rejecting such appeals were the communist-affiliated sugar worker unions, which in 1932 joined together in a national federation that announced its intention to organize and unite all field and mill workers, regardless of race, sex, or national origin, to judge by prominent participation of. Okay, in our conclusion, so sorry I was so briefly interrupted there. So we're going to conclude here. As I was reading before interrupted, it talked about in the 1930s, many Cuban-born workers, both white and black, called for an end to Spanish and West Indian immigration and the reserving of increasingly scarce jobs in sugar and other industries for native-born Cubans. Explicitly rejecting such appeals were the communist-affiliated sugar worker unions, which in 1932 joined together in a national federation that announced its intention to organize and unite all field and mill workers, regardless of race, sex, or national origin, as I just probably read. So you'll probably hear me being repetitive because the interruption. Okay, to judge by the prominent participation of Afro-Cuban and West Indian sugar workers in the strikes and civil violence leading up to the overthrow of the Marquito dictatorship in 1933. This goal was realized. The communist unions opposed the 1934 nationalization of the labor law and the subsequent forced deportation of West Indian workers from the island, and they called for racial employment quotas for every 2 workers hired. One should be black, and racially based affirmative action. That's a familiar word, right? They also briefly proposed that part of the province of Oriente be granted by administrative autonomy and made a semi-independent black republic. During the 1930s, the cadre of Afro-Cuban labor leaders and politicians rose through the party's ranks to emerge as figures of national importance during the 1940s and 1950s, including Blas Roca, Secretary General of the party, Lazaro Pena, Secretary General of the National Labor Federation, Jesus Menendez, Jesus, President of the Sugar Workers Unions, Arcelio Anglese, head of the dock workers, and others. Black involvement in the Colombian labor movement was also substantial. As in Brazil and Cuba, the dock workers' unions in Cartagena and other ports were predominantly black and mulatto. So were the unions of riverboat workers along the Magdalena River, and the United Fruit Company developed banana plantations along Colombia's Caribbean coast in the early 19th century. It hired heavily among the local black mulatto peasantry. By 1925, the workforce of 25,000 had begun to organize a network of workers' committees on each plantation. As in other parts of Latin America, this movement was multiracial, drawing not just on the black majority, but on Mestizo migrants from the highlands who had come to work on the plantation and Indian laborers from the nearby Guajira region. It was also a communist organizers from the highlands found when they arrived in the banana zones in 1927, strongly identified with the popular left wing of the Liberal Party. Okay, we're going to finish up here. By the end of 1928, the banana workers were ready to confront the company over issues of pay, medical care, housing, and other conditions. During November and early December, with support from local smallholders and liberal artisans and merchants in the towns of the banana zones, they brought the plantations to a halt in a region-wide general strike. The strike ended on the night of December 5th when Colombian troops opened fire on several thousand strikers gathered in the town of Cienega. To this day, no one knows how many workers died. The officers in charge of the repression reported 9 workers killed, that night and 38 more in the weeks of repression that follow. Witnesses present insisted that hundreds died. The total is impossible to determine because, as in the Haitian massacre of 1937, government troops removed the bodies before daybreak and buried them in unmarked graves. This is what they do. This is what they do. They'll always give you a number. That's just like in Black Wall Street. They said 300 people died. You know more than that died. I mean, come on. How are you going to believe a devil that does you harm? I mean, that's going to kill and murder you and exploit you, and then you can believe something that comes out of his mouth? Alrighty then, we're going to finish up. The massacre of the banana workers epitomizes the multiple dramas and conflicts of the export years. Black peasants seeking wage employment left their small holdings to sign on with a foreign-owned corporation growing tropical produce for export to the United States. Once in the company's employ, those workers combined long-standing traditions of negotiation, bargaining, and resistance with new modes of labor mobilization to try to effect improvement in their situations. Company officials responded by calling in the armed forces on an oligarchical regime supported by the revenues of the export trade and committed to the values of order, progress, civilization, and whitening. Wow. And in the name of those values, government troops murdered an unknown number of striking workers. In the massacre was emblematic of the export years in its causes. It was emblematic as well in its consequences. The Colombian banana workers were part of the wave of labor mobilization throughout Afro-Latin America that, along with urban middle classes and dissidents, elites, formed a growing source of opposition to landowner rule. As the export economies entered a period of crisis during the 1920s and then collapsed completely during the Great Depression, the conservative republics were swept aside in country after country to be replaced by new regimes based in large part on support from organized labor. In Colombia in particular, labor leaders refused to let the deaths of the banana workers pass unnoticed, demanding a congressional investigation that led in 1929 to the impeachment of the Minister of War. The following year, the Conservative Party was voted out of power and a liberal was elected president. This first liberal president since the 1880s was from the right wing of the party. But as the Depression continued to deepen, the next liberal president, Alfonso Lopez, elected in 1934, was drawn from the left wing of the party and enjoyed the full support of the nation's labor movement. The Great Depression of the 1930s brought the export boom to an end, and along with it, the oligarchical republics and their commitment to whitening. Throughout Afro-Latin America, national societies turned to the task of constructing new economies, new systems of governance, and new visions of national identity and mission. As they did so, they sought inspiration not in the civilizations and cultures of Europe, but in the multiracial, political, and cultural movements created during the export years. Those movements were simultaneously profoundly modern and deeply rooted in the Afro-Latin American past. And as during the independent wars 100 years before, they would now drive forward a second great wave of social political reform. In conclusion, so we thank you for staying with us for this entire series on the whitening of Afro-Latin America, and we're going to be coming back with more. Again, we're still talking about how these particular islands were decimated by bringing in these Europeans and how destructive they were and how they do things. And that has not changed over the years. So, again, remain vigilant with us and stay with us as we continue to bring you more episodes of exactly how these things formed in these Afro Latin American islands and so forth. So until the next time, we're going to be signing out for now. So make sure that you visit us, make sure that you stay with us, and we'll be coming back to you again very, very soon with the next episode here on Anchor by Spotify. This is Seth Moore signing out. Thank you again, as always.